Christmas Eve, I got a call from Scott. Laci's missing. Have you talked to her today?
Welcome to MsMojo, and today we're delving into the chilling events of the disappearance and murder of Laci Peterson.
You take the bits and pieces and you put them all together, then it draws a picture.
A fateful Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve of 2002, Sharon Rocha's life changed forever when she received a phone call from her son-in-law, Scott Peterson, asking where her daughter Laci was.
He said, well, then she's missing. Missing? What do you mean missing? I mean, people don't use that term lightly.
The pair had allegedly started the day tuning into Martha Stewart together before going their separate ways. Scott embarked on a fishing trip, and Laci prepared to run errands and walk their dog. It soon became apparent that she was missing, and the police were quickly called, with the situation being made more urgent by the fact that Laci was 8 months pregnant.
Not only does pregnancy increase the risk of victimization, it is the #1 cause of death for pregnant women.
The life of Laci Peterson. Laci Peterson was born Laci Rocha in 1975 in the town of Escalon in California's Central Valley and eventually relocated to Modesto. She was described by friends and family as a very active kid and a fun-loving, joyful, and caring person.
I would get notes home from the teachers. Occasionally she talked a little too much. That's where the Jabberjaws came from. It was just a little nickname we had for her.
As a child, she enjoyed gardening with her mother and working on her family's dairy farm, and later became involved with cheerleading in high school. She met Scott while studying horticulture at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. The pair were married in 1997 when 22-year-old Laci became a college graduate, and 5 years later, she was pregnant with their first child, who was to be named Connor.
I was happy for her, but for some reason I just had in the back of my mind that something didn't feel quite right because he didn't want to have kids at all, and then all of a sudden he did, and that concerned me.
The initial search. Friends, family, and community members mobilized for a massive search effort in the hopes of finding Laci, and the case quickly gathered significant media attention. Tips poured into helplines, candlelit vigils were held, and a $500,000 reward was eventually offered.
Because of the media attention that exploded, there were over 11,000 tips that came into Modesto Police Department on this case from all over the country.
Police interviewed witnesses who claimed to see a pregnant woman walking her dog, but there are various accounts on whether any were able to positively identify her as Laci. A tip on a suspicious van in the neighborhood also fizzled out.
One neighbor that saw it originally, she said it was white, then it became tan, then it became brown as her statement continued. Totally ruins her credibility.
The burglars. Days after Laci's disappearance, the Medinas, who lived across the street from the Petersons and had been out of town for a bit, returned home to discover that they had been robbed. An investigation began immediately, with police strongly suspecting the burglary was related to Laci's disappearance.
And there was nothing very concrete about it. The Medinas were burglarized, clearly. When is a big one. Originally, it's the 24th. That's because a neighbor believes they saw a suspicious van outside the Medina house on the 24th.
It didn't take long for two suspects to be identified, Donald Pierce and Stephen Todd, an undynamic duo of petty criminals known to operate in the area. The pair cooperated with police, and it was confirmed that they broke into the house on the morning of December 26th, but the two maintained that they had nothing to do with what happened to Laci.
They knew they were going to jail for the burglary. And there's a code amongst inmates that you don't hurt children and you don't hurt vulnerable women. So not only did they take a polygraph, they were almost begging for a polygraph just so they could have the results to show the other inmates that they had no part of this.
While this timeline has since been disputed, police at the time did not find any evidence to the contrary, and the search for Laci continued.
Their alibi for the 24th, the day Laci disappeared, they checked out. They were with family. They were checked out and cleared.
Scott Peterson's behavior. Throughout the initial investigations, police had aimed to clear Scott, statistically the #1 suspect of any wrongdoing, but he didn't exactly make it easy for them. He had demonstrated a calm demeanor and lack of urgency on Christmas Eve, only calling his mother-in-law after feasting on pizza and milk, taking a shower, and doing some laundry.
He did go to the neighbors, and the first neighbor he told that he was golfing. When he came home, Laci was gone. And when Laci's parents, Sharon and Ron, get there, he mentions that he was fishing, And they were shocked.
Many in his and Laci's family hadn't even been aware that he had just purchased a fishing boat. He did cooperate with police, but was also cagey at times, and at one point, backtracked his willingness to take a polygraph. He was also uncharacteristically silent and avoiding the media, relying on friends and family to keep Laci in the news.
Hey girls, go do this. Renee, talk. I don't want to do this. You guys do it. We need to keep this about Laci.
Laci's picture should be put out there. Her face should be on the news because that's who we're trying to find.
Don't put pictures of us out there.
It's widely acknowledged that there is no perfect or correct way for someone whose loved one has been harmed to behave. In fact, none of Scott's actions individually proved he did anything amiss, but together, they formed a pattern of suspicious behavior that planted seeds of doubt in people's minds.
But I just remember thinking at that moment, well, that was strange. And I thought, well, you know, he's worried. And that's why he's acting the way he was acting, instead of like a husband that's missing his wife.
Amber Frey. The police naturally received thousands of tips in the days after Laci disappeared, and many proved to be fruitless, but one stood out and would dramatically change the course of the investigation.
We're wondering, can this really be happening? I mean, this is crazy. But she had specifics. This is real.
A young woman from Fresno told police that Scott Peterson had been her boyfriend for several weeks. Amber Frey began to reveal the extent of Scott's deceptions. He had initially told her he was unmarried before, quote, coming clean, and claiming he had, quote, lost his wife.
I remember just comforting him, understanding this must be very hard. I didn't know, maybe she died in a car accident, and like there was all these thoughts I wanted to ask, but at the same time with his emotions, I thought, I don't want to pry.
Frey would go on to record hours of phone conversations between her and Scott before coming forward publicly to admit their relationship. This was the final nail in the coffin of public opinion on Scott Peterson, with even Laci's family no longer supporting him or his innocence.
At that point, it solidified everything in our mind that Scott was responsible for what happened to Laci.
Investigations and arrest. Once his relationship with Amber became public knowledge, Scott must have realized he needed to do some damage control and finally began speaking with the media. His efforts backfired, however, after he gave a complete train wreck of an interview to Diane Sawyer that made him look even worse.
Choice I made, and I obviously regret now. You know, I could just decide to stay home.
Meanwhile, police were ramping up their investigations and had Scott under extensive digital and physical surveillance. They also searched his home, warehouse, and boat for forensic or trace evidence. Several anchors made out of concrete were found, which were theorized by prosecutors to have been used to weigh down Laci's remains in the San Francisco Bay, but nothing was ever conclusively proved. In April of 2003, however, everyone's worst nightmare came to pass.
I saw it on the news, and I immediately called the detective, and I said, is it her? And he says, I can't say. He said, but. And I said, okay.
2 bodies that had washed up on the shores of the San Francisco Bay were confirmed to belong to Laci and Connor. Police formally arrested Scott for their murder a few days later in San Diego.
He had orange hair, he had an orange goatee. I walk up and he's out, tell me it wasn't my wife and baby, you know. I'm like, that's ridiculous. I mean, you know, come on, Scott, you know better than that.
Trial and appeals. Scott's trial began in June of 2004. With little forensic evidence available, the prosecution's case hinged on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. One crucial witness was Amber Frey, who testified despite significant media scrutiny and vitriol.
She held her head high when she did testify. I think she earned the respect of the jury. They saw the real Amber Frey, not the mistaken stereotypes.
The defense presented an alternate theory that Laci had been the victim of a kidnapping and emphasized the lack of forensic evidence. After 5 grueling months, Scott was found guilty and given the death penalty. In 2020, however, after Scott continuously maintained his innocence and filed various appeals, his death sentence was overturned, and he was eventually resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Scott Peterson is still guilty. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. However, the question is now whether the prosecutor is going to go back and retry him on the death penalty phase of the case.
The LA Innocence Project eventually joined his appeals team, and his sister-in-law, Laci Peterson, obtained a law degree so she could support the appeal efforts. Numerous issues have been heavily debated and disputed, including the makeup of the jury, disagreements on the investigation and forensic evidence, and the kidnapping victim theory.
What's relevant is, show me what would lead me to conclude he was guilty.
Laci's legacy. Murder consistently ranks as one of the leading causes of death among pregnant women.
The most likely person who will harm someone like her is her intimate partner. And the statistics that we keep on homicide bear this out.
While Laci's death was horrific and tragic, the widespread notoriety of her case has led many to escape potentially similarly harmful situations, and that should be honored. Her legacy lives on in all the women she has saved.
You just realize when you're questioned about your best friend, like how little you knew.